I guess just the first question I'd like to ask the group, and hopefully there might be somebody here willing to share an experience, is, has anybody here ever had a spiritual experience at work? Oh, well, we're going to get into that there. We're about to get into that. But I guess that's my question starting off is, have you had an experience that you feel was spiritual at work? And then following that up, what is it exactly that made it a spiritual experience? Does anybody have anything they'd like to share? Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Oh, okay, yeah.
You're not sure you are awake or not, but and there's a few moments you feel whether you are in heaven or on earth, that you're not sure where you are. No?
Mm-hmm. I think that's very interesting, actually. So is it that feeling that you're kind of outside of yourself, you mean? Or like you're not sure where you're at? Or what is it that makes that a spiritual feeling for you?
It's like sleep and fully awake.
Yeah.
That process.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool. That's a very interesting way to see it, actually. I'd never thought of it that way. And I think that kind of plays into the whole idea, like what exactly is spirituality? And we have, you have these experiences and they feel very spiritual to us. And when you actually try to verbalize that or explain what it is that makes them spiritual, it gets very difficult, right? So basically, to go into the full disclosure right away, workplace spirituality is honestly something I don't know that much about. It's something that I started getting into about within the past year. I'm doing my PhD in organizational psychology currently, and the more I always valued this idea of meaningful work and finding a calling in life, and it always seemed like something that was so important. And then I found out about this thing called spirituality in the workplace. And I said, okay, well, what's that? And then what got me hooked on it is I started realizing that basically a lot of these ideas that we call spirituality are really ideas that have been around in psychology for a long time and in philosophy for an even longer time. And that's what really started getting me that interested in it. So what I'd like to do here is just basically present you with a little overview of what exactly spirituality in the workplace is, what it entails. And what I'd especially like to get is just to get you talking about what spirituality is in your work. So obviously, and as we saw throughout this conference, we're in the midst of an important shift in the way that organizations focus on employee health and employee well-being. We're moving away from this notion that employee health is an absence of disease or an absence of health, and we're moving towards this notion that the individual is much more and needs to grow at a variety of levels. And at the same time as we're seeing this, we're also seeing the workplace taking on new roles that had been taken on by other social organizations or institutions in the past. And one big example I can think of is the church. A lot of people aren't going to church the way that they were 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. And a lot of people are spending much, much more time in their work. So what I'm starting to see is that the workplace seems to be taking on these roles that the church used to be playing. The church used to be a central part where people could convene socially with other people in their community. It was an element that people were able to feel connected to, not just as an institution, but it was also a way for individuals to feel connected to their God. And in that way, they felt connected to something that was much greater than themselves. And it was also, church was also a place that people went to in their search for meaning, in their search for understanding what exactly their existence is. They turned to the wisdom of the priests or whoever was at church. And what we're seeing now is that people have turned away from that and have started living a very different lifestyle. But we still have these same spiritual needs and questions that we're trying to answer and that we're trying to fill with these other areas of our life. And that's why I think that work is now starting to really play a spiritual role in the lives of people, because people have that gap and they're looking to work to try and fill that in them. And the central idea in workplace spirituality is to recognize that along with the growth of the individual, there's an essential part of that which is spiritual. And you can't leave that at home when you show up for work in the morning. You know, I'm a physical being, I'm also a very spiritual being. And I don't just mean that for myself. All of us are extremely spiritual beings. And we can't forget about that for 8 hours a day and show up at work, and then, you know, hopefully between 6:30 and 7:30 we'll have a little bit of time for spiritual development if we're lucky, right? So that this recognition is essential to spirituality in the workplace, because once you start accepting that people are bringing their entire selves, including their spiritual self, to work, it has a lot of other implications for what else they need from work and what else they're bringing to work with them, and we'll get into that. Before I continue, just one important point that I think I really want to make is that there's an important difference between spirituality and religion. And you could have an entire conference on that, and I don't want to get into it too much. But the way that I see it, religion is spirituality, but spirituality is not necessarily religion, right? And the way I see it is basically you've got spirituality that seems to operate at this higher level, and religion is really more of a social manifestation of that. So based on your culture and based on a social group and these social customs, what we're really doing is expressing our spirituality and trying to develop that. So that being said, I think it's important when you think about workplace spirituality, it's important to keep in mind that in certain instances, religion in the workplace may not actually be a good thing, in the sense that it could be limiting to other people who don't necessarily adhere to that type of religious faith. And if it's portrayed as bringing religion into the workplace specifically, it alienates people who don't adhere by any religion. Whereas if you bring spirituality into the workplace, you're not excluding anybody, because anybody who's religious will be very interested in this idea of spirituality in the workplace. Sorry?
You just can't call it spirituality.
That.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, they associate it with everything fluffy in the world, right? So that's one of the big problems, I think, with spirituality in the workplace, is that it's called spirituality in the workplace, and nobody in an organization even wants to listen to it, right? Well, we'll get back to that in a minute. So just very briefly, there's an interesting concept called respectful pluralism, that's been proposed by somebody named Douglas Hicks, who's written a lot about spirituality in the workplace. And interestingly enough, he's an ordained minister, so you'd expect him to really be pushing the idea of religion in the workplace. And very contrary to that, he speaks of the three basic principles, and I won't get into them because they're quite obvious, but he says that if you're going to bring spirituality into the workplace, they should respect these three basic principles of inviolable dignity, respect of everybody, and the right of everybody to be treated as an equal. But even more important than that, he has three limiting norms, which I think are even more useful than the actual basic principles, because it tells you what spirituality in the workplace should not be. And that's non-degradation, non-coercion, and non-establishment. So any attempt to bring spirituality in the workplace should never degrade another person's value system or system of beliefs, and it shouldn't degrade their ability to practice their spirituality. Nobody should ever be coerced into acting or engaging in activities that, even if they're supposedly spiritual, if they go against their belief or if the person doesn't want to do that. You can't force somebody to be spiritual just because the organization is taking this new turn. And finally, non-establishment is a very important one, which I think gets overlooked by a lot of well-meaning leaders in organizations who decide that they have very strong religious values, and they feel it's a good thing to bring that into the business. And it is. I mean, it's a very well-intentioned desire. But the problem is that when that's done, it's done often by establishing this as a Christian workplace or as a Islamic workplace, or however you want to see it. And the second you start doing that, you're alienating certain sectors of your workforce, right? And yes, which is what you see. And there's a very touchy issue, and that's another issue which a lot of people are very iffy about the idea of spirituality because of the whole human rights issue. And especially, I know I'm from Quebec, right? So the separation of church and state is a very strong thing, and the separation of church and work is a very strong thing to Quebecers. So I think that this distinction between what is religion and what is spirituality is essential if you're going to be bringing it back into the workplace, and if you're going to get people to kind of stop shying away from it too much, right? And finally, it's part of a desire for spirituality. It really reflects a shift that we're seeing in the workers. More and more as we see the generations of workers that are already in the workplace, but especially the generations that are coming into the workplace, this idea of meaningful work is very important to them. So what is spirituality in the workplace? It's a highly personal experience, so it's very tough to define. And sorry, I realized I said I was going to try to go through this relatively fast, and I just took about 10 minutes on the first slide. So I'm really going to start going much faster. If there's anything you want me to elaborate more upon, please just stop me, and I'll gladly do that. But spirituality is a very personal experience, and that's part of why it's so difficult to define, because the second anybody starts doing any work in spirituality, they already have a very personal experience of what that is. So it's tough to start trying to link everybody's definitions back together. However, if we're going to move this forward as an actual science, and I sincerely believe that spirituality can be studied scientifically, I don't see any problem with that. We do need to agree on some type of definition so that we don't have 80 different pieces of research with 80 different definitions of spirituality, because none of them can be reconciled. And when you look at the literature on spirituality in the workplace, what you in fact see is that there's a lot of different definitions, but there's this consistent convergence on these 4 themes that you see up here. So the first main theme is self-work integration. The second one is this sense of purpose, which we've been talking about throughout the conference, so I won't elaborate too much. And finally, there's a sense of self-transcendence, or a connection to something that's greater than oneself. And at the end, there's the development of the inner self. And all of these, as I mentioned earlier, these are all things that people were doing through their participation in religious activities, and which now is shifting into the work domain as people are seeking to fill these needs elsewhere. So self-work integration is this, as I mentioned earlier, this idea that you can't bring only a part of yourself to work, right? You show up to work and you bring a spiritual component, whether your bosses like it or not, and whether you like it or not. And it's very difficult for people to engage in work if they're not being fully engaged as a person. And if organizations want to engage the entire individual, and you know, engagement is one of these buzzwords now, well, you really do need to engage every aspect of the individual, including their spiritual self. So asking people to leave their spiritual values or ethical values at home so that they can conduct a certain type of work that goes against their values is going to be very difficult for a lot of people. And we've seen this in organizational studies. We look at a lot of person-organization ethical fit and values congruence and these types of things. So it's not a new idea at all. But this notion that people have a need to feel integrated is essential to workplace spirituality. And a lot of people, especially when you look at the organizational studies, there's a lot of work that's been done on the need to adapt to different roles in your life, right? And that's true. You know, we play the role of a parent, of a child, of a friend, of a manager, of somebody else's subordinate. So we have a lot of different roles, and that entails a lot of different ways to act. And that's just a reality of life, and you can try to act in just a single set of ways throughout your life, and that might work, but it might not work, and it might make it much more difficult for you to navigate the different aspects of your life. And but what you in fact see when you look at a lot of the more clinical research in psychology is that they tend to treat this idea of separating yourself into different cells for different aspects of your life as a type of self-fragmentation. And what seems most important over and above this idea of having different selves or different roles is the authenticity, because what the studies are finding is that it's not so much a question of the number of different roles that you're forced to play in your life. It's the level of authenticity that you're able to do those in. So even though you may have to act a little bit differently based on the specific domain that you're in, the level of authenticity that you're able to do that in is key. And that's really what the key is here, is that's recognizing that spirituality should be brought into the workplace basically stems from this notion that you recognize that you need to bring in the entire individual to the workplace, and that individuals have a need to behave and engage in their work authentically. And once you accept that, then the rest of the dimensions of spirituality start flowing. Because, for example, you recognize that everybody has a need for purpose in their life. And if you recognize that you can't leave that quest at home, you can't be doing that on your off time or on the weekends, then as an organization, you almost come to see yourself as having a responsibility to help these people find a meaning through their work. And we've seen throughout the conference how important that is for people. So I won't even really get into it much more than this. Next, there's the issue of self-transcendence, and that's the need that people have to feel connected to something greater than themselves. And organized faiths have played this role for thousands of years, where what we're basically wrestling with is our own finiteness, and we're one small piece of existence, and we don't really understand that existence. So how do we reconcile that with our notions of infinity or of things that continue on? And religion has always helped us to link ourselves back to this infinite, all-being, transcendent God. And what that helps us to do is feel that even though our life is going to come to an end and that we're only one small bit, we're actually a part of something much, much greater than ourselves. And that's very important for people. And what we're seeing now is that people can actually, even outside of a church and outside of this notion of connecting to a specific God, people are still able to get those feelings that they're a part of something much greater. And that can be at several different levels. Feeling that you're part of an organization that you actually value and that you believe in what the organization is doing. It extends yourself. And I know if you go back to Freudian terms, it's ego extension, right? Where you're pushing your existence beyond the limits of who your physical self is. And that can be done either through connection to your work, it can be done through service to others, where you're seeing that through the work that you're doing, you're serving others, you're benefiting some greater cause, be it humanity, be it your specific community that you live in some way, or be it just the organization and the other people that you work with. You're part of something that's greater than yourself, and that's very important for people, and it's very spiritual for people when you realize that. And actually, I think I'll just leave it at that for now. And finally, what we get to is inner growth. And this is one of the dimensions that is, the other three are very consistent when you look at all the different definitions in the literature. And this is one that some people tend to overlook, and they assume that everything else kind of plays into it. But and that's just what my question is there, is what's the good of having meaningful work and having feelings of transcendence at work if you're not aware of it? And I think a lot of people may actually be engaging in a lot of spirituality in the workplace without even realizing it. And that's why I think that this dimension of inner growth is essential, because you need to provide people with the basic skills and with the opportunities that they need to reflect on the experiences that they're having and make them into spiritual experiences. Right? And people need to be actively engaged in that. You can't just place people in a type of work that you feel is going to be meaningful for them and expect that to just grow from there. You need to engage people in that. And that's why this idea of inner growth is so essential, I feel. Just one quick example of spirituality in the workplace that's one of the classic examples that we often hear about is Cordon Bleu or Tommaso, which is a large Canadian, actually I think it's in Canada, it's the biggest manufacturer of like frozen pasta foods, so frozen lasagnas and things like that. And as you can imagine, this like when you work in that type of factory where they're producing all this, it's very, very cold because they have to keep the temperature quite low. And it's a very industrial type of environment. So it's not the type of place that's very comfortable. And in a lot of situations, it's the type of environment that actually leads to relatively low psychological health. Except 2 years ago, at this particular organization, the union signed, I believe it was either a 20 or a 25-year contract with the management of the organization, because they're so happy with the way things are that they're worried that when the leader of the organization, who's about 80 years old, passes away, things are going to change, and they don't want it to change. So that's why they signed as high of a contract as the organization was willing to sign, or as an agreement as the organization was willing to go for. And how did this all come about? Well, as I mentioned, they had a very, very devout leader. He was a very religious man. He owned his company, and it gradually grew over the years into a large, large organization. And he firmly believed that he was doing God's work, that he had, and this is very interesting, very existential, because it came from a realization that he had, as a leader for this organization, he had control over the well-being of so many other people. And with that comes the responsibility to ensure their well-being, but also to nurture their growth. And how he did that was through God. So in this case, they didn't necessarily endorse specifically Christian values, although it definitely came from a Christian type of perspective, right? So the types of things that they did, company meals. I mean, these are the types of things which we think of, okay, that's just the regular thing any organization does. But when it's done in a spiritual context, where everybody is offering thanks for what they do, is taking the time to reflect on the meal, on what it means to be part of that work community, on what they're doing. And it's done on a regular basis. It's not a single annual meal, right? They have several meals every year, and it's a chance for everybody to get together, eat together, share together, and be a part of that same community, right? They instituted prayers before meetings, and they're not necessarily Our Father prayers. They're just prayers, take a moment to reflect on something important, reflect on what we're going to be doing here, what's our mission, or reflect on something that we're quite grateful for. And that's the same type of thing that you see in any type of organized religious prayer, right? Finally, contemplation room, shared company bonuses. So, and there's a number of other things that they did here, but what's really important is that they changed the organization's culture, where what they said is, we value everybody here, and we value your growth as an individual, and we want this to become an environment where you can grow as an individual. And what's important to note here is that this is one of the textbook examples of things that were well done, and it's one of the rare examples you have where you had management. You had an idea that came fully top down, so obviously it had full support from the leadership. They were willing to expend a lot of resources in there. And the employees bought into it quite fast as well. And even then, it took them about 8 or 9 years to really get to where they are today in terms of a spiritual organization, because they ran into all sorts of bumps along the way. And one of the main things and the main issue for success in any type of intervention like this is keeping your employees involved and going back and asking them, how is this working out for you? Do you like this? What's not working for you? One of the examples, they had a prayer room which they offered to employees. And it's not, and the whole idea there is basically when you have a moment during the day, you have something you need to go think about, you're feeling whether it's because you're feeling very good or grateful or because you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed. They arrange for you to have a room to go to, and they also make it part of the culture that it's okay for you to take a break at your own leisure. And the other people that you work with in your unit are going to cover for you while you're gone. And because that's happening, people don't tend to skip out for a half-hour break because their friends are back there covering for them. And so that was a very interesting thing that they did. But one of the problems that they did is the only space that was available was 2 doors down from the CEO's office, who had a literal open-door policy. So he's often in his office with the door wide open. And people were shy to walk right in front of the CEO and go into the prayer room because they weren't sure if they were taking a break, and they just felt like they were being observed. And he realized this, and it took a year and a half, I think, of everything going on, and then they realized nobody really seems to be using the prayer room. And they asked people, what's going on? And they weren't comfortable with where it was. And right away, they changed the room. They found another location that was a little bit easier for everybody to access, and people started using it right away. And that's what I think the main thing to remember with these types of things is you've got to keep employees involved, not just in the planning, but you need to consistently go back and ask them, is this working for you? And if it is, why? And if it isn't, why not? Just to get into the theoretical bit a little bit quickly, as I said, my one worry, and you said, you talked earlier about, it's called spirituality, and I said that's one of its biggest problems, right? And companies just aren't willing to hear this. Interestingly enough, Maslow wrote a really interesting book called Upsikian Management in 1965, I believe, a very early book. It touches on all the same themes that we've been talking about at this conference, the importance of transcendence, the importance of meaningful work, and it touches on a lot of the same things that you see in spirituality in the workplace. And even in 1965, I mean, Maslow was already well regarded as a motivation theorist, and nobody was really willing to listen to it. It was just too fluffy and it was too out there. In 1998, it was republished as Maslow on Management. Same book, different title, and it became an instant bestseller, especially in organizations, right? And people, and I think a big thing there was the name, and I see that same parallel with spirituality in the workplace. The difference, I think, is that organizations now are willing to actually listen to what the content is. So when I started kind of trying to review exactly what spirituality in the workplace is and how it affects well-being, what I kept seeing is that we already know a lot of these things from psychological literature that's existed for a long time, right? And it comes from these 3 areas. So just to go through them relatively fast, conservation of resource theory is a stress-based theory for motivation and well-being, where basically everything in your environment, from character strengths to physical resources in the environment, become resources that help you to deal with stress. So anything in your environment that either takes away those resources or threatens your resources becomes very stressful to the individual. And I think that this it's a very limited way to see well-being. But I think it gives you an interesting perspective on how spirituality in the workplace is not just something that is, once everything is all nice and good, then you start bringing in spirituality in the workplace and you see the benefits. Because it can help you with what you call deficiency situations, where people actually are lacking certain resources. Self-work integration, a sense of purpose and meaning, a sense of transcendence and inner growth. These are all things that provide you with very important resources that help you to deal with different stresses in the workplace. And I mean, just as we saw today, and there's a lot of research that backs this up, being able to find a sense of purpose in suffering or in the loss of resources, be they physical resources in terms of a sudden handicap, or be they loss of resources in terms of your job. If you're able to find some type of meaning in that, it really helps to buffer the effects of stress there. Being part of something that's greater than yourself is a source of extremely important social support, right? And we tend to overlook that. But that's what spirituality and religion provides us with a lot of, is social support from other people and knowing that we're connected to other people who are like us and who are in the same type of situation as us. So, as I said, all of these can be seen as an important resource against stress, but the problem here is that well-being is basically defined as the absence of stress. And I think if there's one thing we can say from this conference is that well-being goes well beyond the mere absence of disease or illness or stress. So sorry about that. Another interesting theory which has been widely accepted in the organizational sciences, you see it all over the place as a theory of motivation and again of well-being, is self-determination theory, right? And this just plays on our need basically to be motivated by autonomous goals and not goals that are externally derived. And the three basic needs that you see coming up again and again, or not again and again, it's just the three basic needs in self-determination theory, are a need for relatedness, a need for mastery or competence, and a need for autonomy. So as you can see, and I think especially for the need for relatedness, I don't really need to explain how spirituality can play into that. But when you're looking at the need for competence, feeling that you're able to be your authentic self at work, feeling that you've got a sense of purpose and that you're having a meaningful effect through your work, and feeling that you're connected to others or to a group that's actually important to you, and that you're growing through this process, is all going to play into your feeling of competence and mastery as an individual, right? So there's, and these links between these basic needs and psychological well-being have been demonstrated time and time again. So again, I think that spirituality in the workplace is a new take, it's a new approach on these things, but the actual phenomena that's happening here in terms of mental health and psychological well-being are things that we're already well aware of. And one thing that's often overlooked in self-determination theory is that self-realization, this idea of reaching your full potential as a human being, or which in humanistic psychology we call self-actualization, self-validation. In SDT, it's self-realization. And it's a central component of well-being, according to DC and Ryan. But when you look at a lot of the more organizationally oriented research, they focus specifically on these three basic needs, because starting to talk about self-realization is starting to bring you into the fringe of organizational literature, where people may not be willing to hear what you have to say. And even though I think that this obviously provides a much better conceptualization over conservation of resources, it's still lacking a few things. So this kind of brings us to just the general idea of psychological well-being in the workplace. And this is an area that started to receive much more interest in the last 30 years. But even as far back as the 1980s, we already had the major definitions of psychological well-being, recognizing that it was it went well beyond, again, the absence of stress, and it included much more than that. And what we see here is that basically they included the same three basic dimensions of self-determination theory, but they also included these important new dimensions, which are self-acceptance, a sense of purpose, and a sense of personal growth. So when you actually try to conceive that as different paths for spirituality in the workplace to affect well-being, what you see is that obviously being able to be your authentic self at work and to engage in personally meaningful things are obviously going to play into self-acceptance, right? And then there's this idea of self-validation, which we've been talking about throughout the conference, this idea of finding purpose and of experiencing personal growth through your work. And then finally, down at the bottom, again, what we've got is just the relatedness, mastery, and autonomy of self-determination theory. So then if we just add this idea of reduced stress at the top, you can see that there's a number of different ways that spirituality in the workplace actually affects the well-being of people in the workplace. But it's not a whole new frontier, and there's no need for a whole new literature showing this, because we already know how these mechanisms, reduced stress, self-acceptance, self-validation, and the basic needs of self-determination theory, we know how these play into psychological well-being, right? So I think that this is something that's important to realize, and it's also important. First of all, it's important to realize that we don't start recreating a whole new literature or base of research, which we've already got. And the second reason why it's very important is that spirituality in the workplace is not going to be an easy thing to sell to organizations. It's going to sound fluffy. It's going to sound like a trend or a fad that's going to pass. And what it really is it's based on all these important phenomena which have been well grounded in organizational science already. So even myself, when I talk to other students in my department, what are you going to the conference to talk about? Spirituality in the workplace. Okay. Well, actually, no, I'm talking about self-determination theory, finding a sense of meaning in your work, finding a sense of self-transcendence, and integration. Oh, well, that makes sense, right? So it's not just the people who have been reared in the extreme financial backgrounds that do this. It's anybody who's in psychology, who's in the scientific approaches. Spirituality sounds fluffy, and not everybody's willing to hear the word and see it for what it is. So I think that's one thing that's very important to keep in mind. A quick note that I want to put, just to mention, is that person-organization fit is key. What we've seen here is that there's four different dimensions that tend to operate in relatively distinct ways in affecting well-being. But the truth is that those aren't necessarily going to fit for everybody. Different people have different spiritual needs. Different people have different sources that they use to fulfill their spiritual need. If I'm finding all of my meaning, or most of the meaning in my life, through my family, or through care or through whatever that I do outside of work, then trying to sell me my work as something meaningful if I don't need it to be and I don't want it to be is not necessarily going to be as effective for me as if I've got this void in my life and I'm trying to find meaning somewhere and I've got nowhere, right? And this just highlights the importance of trying to bring spirituality into their workplace. Ask them what they want and what they need, because not everybody needs the same things. And it's important to provide them with different options as well, because what's going to work for somebody, a prayer room might work fantastic for a few people who really feel that need to take a little bit of time, develop some self-awareness, just take some time away. Whereas for somebody else, that might not be at all the way that they engage in their own spirituality. So it's important to provide people with options, and especially to let them know that it's okay to discuss what's working and what's not working for them. So this, as I said, it's just a basic way to visualize the different ways that organizational phenomena that we already know a lot about actually affect well-being in the workplace. Slightly negative note I just want to mention. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the expression greenwashing. You know, I don't know if you've noticed in the last year or two or three the amount of suddenly environmentally friendly organizations. I mean, you know, it's fantastic. Everybody now is green and everybody loves the environment, and I think that's really good. And all the ads reflect that very much. And the problem that you see there is all these organizations are portraying themselves as very environmentally friendly, as very green, and really what that is a marketing effort. And unfortunately what we're seeing is that you've got a lot of organizations who are starting to sell themselves as spiritual organizations, and that's really more of a recruitment trend or an advertising or marketing ploy. And that's a very important, it's something that really gets to me, to be honest, just because it's a big threat to the development of spirituality in the workplace, the same way as greenwashing is a threat to the development of sustainable businesses. Because if it's seen as just a type of marketing, then people stop paying attention to it and organizations eventually get over it, and it just gets left behind as just this useless fad. Let's just get over it. And it's more than a fad. It's really something that's going to be starting to come into the workplace more and more. And organizations need to realize that if they want to actually start engaging their employees, they need to do so authentically. You can't portray yourself. There's a really interesting article actually by Kathy Driscoll and I forget her name. And it was Kathy Driscoll's a teacher at St. Mary's University, and they did an interesting look at two organizations which are kind of like the prototypical soul-washing organizations. One of them is called Tyson Foods, and I believe it's mostly poultry, but it's processed meat, a company that processes meat in the United States, and who have, for about 10 years now, they have a chaplaincy program. They have a prayer room in their organizations, and people have access to a chaplain to come in and speak to. And I'm not trying to take that away. I think it's a nice initiative to have, but the organizations have consistently been found guilty of mistreating the animals and animal cruelty and mistreating employees. And there's been all sorts of labor grievances brought against them for withholding wages from employees, hiring illegal immigrants, and all sorts of other types of things, which are extremely, extremely unspiritual. So just that note that I wanted to bring. It's an excellent read, and it's so easy to read. It's just written, it's a conversation, right? So it's as if you're listening to people as you read it. It's probably a 1 or 2 week read, and it's a really good way to get anybody who's not as familiar with the concepts we've been talking about to start understanding a little bit more about the self-validation of the workplace. Having said that, I managed to probably use up my entire half hour despite my effort to get through that a little bit fast. I was just, do we have any time?
What's the schedule?
We have a few minutes. No, not at all. Okay, we don't have any time. I'm sorry. I would have loved to try to discuss a little bit of spirituality with people. I hope you'll take a little something away from today's conversation, at least, and realize that really spirituality in the workplace is not that new. It's something everybody needs, and it's something that is happening in a lot of our lives, and what it really requires is the awareness that it's happening in our lives in order to make it spiritual.
Sometimes it's the only thing that gets you through being in the workplace.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, in the same way that I think what you said is a good point that I didn't mention with the conservation of resources and all the other theories, is that even though you have work that can drain resources left and right on you, if it's meaningful work and it allows you to feel connected to others and it plays into your spiritual self,
it can be very fulfilling. People can love their work, despite the fact that it goes against every psychological theory of resources, because it's draining your energy and it's draining everything out of you. So yeah, I think it's essential. I think more and more we're going to see this coming into the workplace, or at least I hope so.